Sometimes, Percy takes trains of stone trucks to the other end of the line, and when he's there, he meets engines from the other railway. He's good friends with them and likes to tell them about his past adventures, much to the annoyance of the other engines who just want to rest in the shed. These 4 engines only show up in one illustration at the start of Percy Takes the Plunge, so I thought it would be interesting to see a bit more from them. And what better way to do that than to draw some illustrations? For this video, I've decided to draw the engines in order from top to bottom as we see them in the original art. And the engine next to Henry looks rather a lot like a London and North Western Railway coal tank, designed by Francis Webb. I figured that it would be a good class of engine to base this engine on. I'm not entirely sure whether or not any coal tanks, or indeed any of the engine classes featured in this video, would have actually worked at Barrow-in-Furness. Most likely the only small tank engines working there at the time were Ginties, but much like my first video on the mid-Sodor engines, I figured that it would be a bit boring to just have 4 engines that look exactly the same. Maybe we can rationalise it by saying that engines from other sheds would travel to Barrow specifically to hear Percy's stories. Ginty themselves will be appearing in a future video down the line, so look out for that. For these drawings, I've tried to emulate the style of John T. Kenny, the illustrator of the Railway series books 12 to 17. I sometimes go through phases of having different favourite artists for the Railway series, but honestly I think that Kenny may well be my favourite of all the illustrators. Compared to C. Reginald Dolby, he definitely has a better handle on perspective and keeping the engine designs consistent between illustrations. At the same time, I feel as though Kenny's illustrations still retain a lot of what made Dolby's illustrations so appealing, mainly in terms of colour choice and visual clarity. Going back to the coal tanks, similar to the Midland Railway Flat Iron and the Clocker Valley Railway Sharpies, I made a trains model of one back in the day. Again, like those other engine classes, it's very old at this point. About 5 years ago I actually did make a start on a new trains coal tank, but never got round to finishing it. Maybe if I find the time and motivation to get back into trains modelling I'll give it another go, but don't hold your breath. The book that these characters appeared in, The 8 Famous Engines, was published in 1957 and the stories take place during the year prior. Interestingly, although the last of the coal tanks was withdrawn in 1958, I believe it was something of an outlier, with the second last surviving member of the class being withdrawn some years earlier. I've decided to use this information to influence my backstory for Webster. I'm thinking that by the time we see him in the books he's already been withdrawn, and has become something of a nomad, travelling across the country to different sheds and maybe even some industrial lines to hang around and do odd jobs. Legend has it that he's still travelling to private industrial railways to help out where and when he can. I've drawn Webster on one of his many journeys along the main line, travelling light engine with a brake van in tow and anxiously waiting at a gantry for his signal to drop, or rise depending on what region of British Railways he's currently in. If he's lucky then the signalman won't get suspicious and ring up the BR officials to tell them that one of their scrapped engines is in steam and fit as a fiddle. With all that said, here is the finished drawing. This character was another engine where it seemed like Kenny had an engine class in mind when he drew him. In this case he looks rather like a North Eastern Railway Class E1, also known as the LNER Class J72. This was a rather numerous and ubiquitous class of engine, first appearing in the late 1800s, but was still being built as late as 1951, so for all we know, Ewan here could be as young as 5 years old. It's worth noting that for the first time in this series, none of the illustrations take place on Sodor, so I don't have to worry too much about adhering to Audrey's track plans. In this case, I've decided to set the drawing on some sidings with some industrial buildings in the background. I think the brick buildings and gasometers really sell the idea that this drawing takes place in the north of England during the 1950s. I've given names to all these engines, but I can't say I know how exactly they got them, since it can be easily assumed that the other railway was somewhat more impersonal with its engines compared to Sodor's railways. In his own book, Stepney mentions that some of his colleagues on the Bluebell Railway never had names before being preserved, so maybe there's a possibility that these tank engines were never given names either. Perhaps they named themselves, or maybe Percy gave them their names. So then, what's your name? Haven't got one. You haven't got a name? Who'd heard of an engine with no name? That just won't do. Nobody ever gave me a name. Just the number 69020 and Class E1. E1? How about Ewan? That sounds better than 69020. Ewan? Hey, I like that. That's settled then. This is my first time drawing Percy in one of these videos, believe it or not. His appearance went through several changes throughout the book's run. If you search hard enough, you'll probably find a fan theory about him being a Time Lord. I've always been partial to John Kenny's design for Percy. Whilst I do like his more realistic portrayal in tramway engines, Kenny's interpretation is more obviously based on Dalby's design for the character, but more consistently drawn. With that said and done, here is the completed illustration. Compared with the first two engines, these last two engines don't appear to be based on anything specific. However, I did want to retain the theme of engines that primarily worked up north. I noticed that the third engine had quite a low rounded cab, which reminded me of the North Eastern Railway Class 290, also known as the LNER J77. Jason, much like the other engines of his class, was rebuilt from an 044 well tank into an 060 with side tanks. The original bogie tank passenger engines, or BTPs, were originally built between 1874 and 1884, so Jason must be getting on a bit. Despite his age, he can still be cheeky, because he's just that sort of engine. Here's Jason on the turntable, having a conversation with a somewhat irritated Henry. So, my mate Percy says you're his friend. Percy's not my friend, he's just a silly little engine. He were telling us about the time he travelled through floods in the pouring rain just to bring some children home. What have you done? Well, one time some children threw stones at me and so I sneezed at them. You sneezed at some children? That's your crowning moment? Away, man! Needless to say, Henry was not pleased. Eventually he would get a true crowning moment when he rescued two failed diesels, but Henry never saw Jason afterwards to tell him about his achievement. I didn't really give them the time of day before starting work on this drawing, but the J77s have grown on me quite a bit now. At a glance they just kind of look like your run-of-the-mill 060 tank engine, but the rounded cab and square windows give them a fair amount of character, and the fact that they were rebuilds of much older engines with a completely different appearance adds another layer of interest. I've said this about other engine classes, but it bears repeating. It's a shame that none were preserved. If you haven't noticed already, this is actually the same location that the original illustration of the 4 engines takes place, just at a different angle. I made sure to add some trucks and vans in the yards in the background, ready to be erased for Henry's goods train. And so, here is the finished drawing. When looking at the illustration, I noticed that the engine on the bottom left doesn't have any side rods connected to his front set of wheels. Now this may be an oversight, but alternatively it could be that this engine has a leading axle. By this point there were no 240 tank engines in service on British Railways aside from the BT Well tank, which worked in the West Country. But I still wanted this engine to be quite small. In the end I went with the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 5. I have made one change to the Class 5 design to make Horace better match the illustration: the addition of sandboxes on the front of the running board. I had trouble finding 242 tanks, or 442 tanks for that matter, with front sandboxes, or at least ones that would have still been running during the mid to late 50s. Interestingly, James, who is also based on a Lancashire and Yorkshire engine, is derived from a design that did have sandboxes, even though James himself doesn't have them. Maybe these are James's old sandboxes that somehow ended up on Horace. That could be an interesting story idea. Unlike the other 3 engines, Horace doesn't do an awful lot of goods or shunting work, instead pulling passenger trains on a nearby branch line. Because of this, he's a little more innocent and sheltered than the others, not being used to dealing with trucks or being bossed around by bigger engines. Nevertheless, he is particularly enamoured by Percy's escapades, many of which involve the goods and shunting work he's done, and Horace is interested in hearing perspectives from engines in different fields of work than himself. Maybe there's another idea for a story where Horace tries out other jobs, like shunting and freight trains, to see what they're like, with this lack of experience resulting in some messy situations. In the original illustration, we only really see Horace's smokebox, so he might not have had the plain unlined black livery like the other engines. During the BR era, the Class 5 wore lined black, and so that's how I've decided to draw him. I've chosen to draw Horace on his branch line, somewhere in the north of England. He's travelling through some fields with a couple of coaches behind him. I thought I was done at one point, but when seeing it again after a while I thought it could do with some extra details and touch-ups, so I made some final changes. And with that said, here is the finished illustration. And so, there were the 4 Mainland engines that Percy made friends with. This was an interesting challenge, creating characters based on a single illustration, perhaps harkening back to my videos on Sodor's loaned engines and the workshop engines. Now, Percy does have 2 other friends that he met on the mainland, Ginty and Pug, but they'll be showing up in another video sometime in the future. If you want to see that video and more videos like it, be sure to subscribe and comment down below.